the blazing Nevada desert at Naval Air Station Fallon, a supposedly broken-down weapons instructor was about to face the most humiliating moment of her military career. What started as a routine marksmanship demonstration took a shocking turn when she came face to face with Admiral Victor Hale's arrogant attempt to destroy her reputation. Lieutenant Commander Riley Grant wasn't your typical desk-bound instructor. For 18 years, she had spent her life serving in classified operations across Afghanistan, known as ghost shot by insurgents who feared her legendary precision from impossible distances. When she encountered Admiral Hale seizing her .50 caliber Barrett rifle to show proper form, she had no idea she was walking into a moment that would define her entire future. Riley's lightning-fast response, breaking his hand with a textbook joint lock before unleashing 6 perfect shots on moving targets, would lead to her complete transformation from military outcast to special operations legend. What began as a calculated public execution of a damaged officer would become the most spectacular reversal of fortune in Navy history. The entire base would never be the same after witnessing a woman everyone thought was finished prove that some warriors don't break, they just discover new ways to be unstoppable. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Nevada sun beat down on Naval Air Station Fallon like a punishment, turning the tarmac into shimmering lakes of heat that made the distant mountains dance. I stood in the shade of Hangar 7, watching a fresh batch of recruits stumble through weapons handling drills, their movements clumsy and uncertain under the desert glare. Lieutenant Commander Riley Grant, that's me, though most people around here had stopped using my rank with any real respect months ago. The whispers followed me like shadows. Injured in Afghanistan, hand damage, can't grip properly anymore, past her prime. They thought they were being subtle, but 18 years in the Navy had taught me to hear the things people didn't say out loud. The way conversations died when I walked into the mess hall, how junior officers avoided eye contact during briefings, the careful politeness that screamed louder than any insult. My left hand flexed unconsciously around my coffee mug, still stiff, still aching on humid mornings, but functional. More functional than they knew. More functional than I let them see. Some secrets were worth keeping, even from yourself. "Commander Grant?" Ensign Tyler Brooks appeared at my elbow, young face earnest under his pristine cover. Fresh from Annapolis, still believing that merit mattered more than politics. "The recruits are ready for the next phase." I nodded, studying the 20-something faces arranged in formation before us. They looked eager, terrified, and completely unprepared for what the real Navy would demand of them, just like I had been once upon a time. "Today we're covering the M16A4, I announced, my voice carrying easily across the range. "This weapon will keep you alive if you respect it, and kill you if you don't. Pay attention." As I demonstrated the proper grip, my hand trembled slightly. Just a micro movement, barely perceptible, but I caught Sergeant Red Kowalski smirking from his position near the ammunition bunker. The Marine here was for cross-training, and he'd made it clear from day one that he thought Navy instructors were soft, especially damaged ones. The afternoon brought news that made the entire base tense. Admiral Victor Hale was arriving for an unscheduled inspection. I watched from my office window as his convoy rolled through the main gate. 3 black SUVs with enough brass inside to outfit a marching band. Admiral Hale himself emerged from the center vehicle like something from a recruiting poster. Silver hair perfect despite the desert wind, uniform pressed to knife-edge sharpness, chest full of ribbons that told the story of a distinguished career. Chief Petty Officer Elena Morales knocked and entered without waiting for permission, a privilege earned through 15 years of friendship. "Heard the old man's making rounds tomorrow," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Word is he's looking for dead weight to cut." I didn't look up from the training reports I was reviewing. "Then he's come to the right place." "Riley." Her voice carried the same tone she'd used when we were junior officers together, back when the world made more sense. But I wasn't sure anymore. The woman who had put 3 consecutive shots through a terrorist's scope from 800 meters in Kandahar felt like someone I used to know. These days, I struggled to hit center mass at 200 meters with recruits watching. The hand worked fine in private, but put an audience around me, and everything fell apart.
"He's staying for the advanced marksmanship demonstration on Friday," Morales continued. "Wants to see how we're training the next generation of special operations candidates." Friday. 3 days away. 3 days to figure out how to avoid becoming an example of what happens when the Navy keeps broken tools in the arsenal. That night, the officers' quarters felt more like a prison cell than home. I sat at my small desk, staring at the framed photograph from my last deployment, myself and my sniper team after a successful mission, faces blackened with camouflage paint, but eyes bright with the satisfaction of work well done. The woman in that picture had been confident, competent, feared by enemies and respected by allies. Now, I was a cautionary tale told in whispers. Admiral Hale wasted no time making his presence felt. By 0800 the next morning, he was striding across the training range like he owned every grain of sand, his entourage of junior officers and security personnel struggling to keep pace. I stood with the other instructors, watching him approach our weapons demonstration station with the inevitability of an incoming storm. "Commander Grant," he said, his voice carrying the easy authority of someone who had never doubted his place in the world, "I've heard about your situation." The words hung in the desert air like a challenge. Around us, the recruits had stopped their drills to watch, sensing the tension even if they didn't understand its source. Brooks stood at attention nearby, his eyes wide as he took in the scene. "Sir?" I kept my voice level, professional. "The hand injury. Afghanistan, wasn't it?" Admiral Hale's smile was sharp as broken glass. "Admirable that the Navy found a place for you here, training recruits. Less demanding than your previous assignment, I imagine." Heat crept up my neck, but I held his gaze. "I serve where needed, Admiral." "Of course you do." He gestured toward the rifle range. "Perhaps you could demonstrate proper shooting stance for these young sailors, show them how a seasoned professional handles her weapon." It wasn't a request. Around us, I could feel the eyes of every recruit, every instructor, every visiting officer focused on this moment. Kowalski had moved closer, clearly hoping for a show. Brooks looked uncomfortable, probably sensing the undercurrent of malice in what should have been routine instruction. I picked up my designated M16A4, checking the chamber and magazine with practiced efficiency. My hand cooperated, moving through the familiar motions without hesitation. The rifle felt good in my grip, balanced, ready, like an extension of my will. 5 targets, 200 meters, standard qualification course. Let's see what Navy marksmanship looks like these days. I settled into the firing position, feeling the familiar kiss of the stock against my shoulder. The targets wavered slightly in the heat haze, but my breathing was steady, my sight picture clear. This should have been easy. This should have been automatic. Instead, my hand began to shake. Not much, just a tremor that threw off my natural point of aim. I adjusted, compensated, fired. The shot went wide, kicking up dust 6 inches to the right of the target. I could hear someone behind me suppress a snicker. "Take your time, Commander," Hale said, his voice dripping with false encouragement. "No pressure." But there was pressure. All eyes on me, waiting for failure, expecting it. My second shot was better, but still off-center. The third was worse. By the time I finished the string, my target looked like it had been attacked by someone learning to shoot for the first time. "Interesting technique," Hale said, stepping forward to examine my rifle. "May I?" Before I could respond, he was lifting the weapon from my hands, his fingers brushing against mine with casual dismissal. "Sometimes it helps to have fresh perspective, show proper form." He shouldered the rifle with theatrical precision, making sure everyone could see his textbook stance. But when he fired, his shots were no better than mine. Worse, actually. His grip was too tight, his breathing erratic, his follow-through non-existent. The man was a politician in uniform, not a warrior. "Equipment malfunction," he announced, handing the rifle back to me with obvious distaste. "Some weapons require more maintenance than others." The insult was clear to everyone present. I was the malfunctioning equipment, the weapon that required too much maintenance to be worth keeping in service. Brooks was staring at the ground, his face flushed with second-hand embarrassment. Morales had appeared from somewhere, her dark eyes flashing with barely contained anger. But there was nothing to be done. This was the Navy. You saluted, you followed orders, and you kept your mouth shut when your superiors decided to make examples of you.
"Thank you for the demonstration, Commander," Hale said, already turning away. "Most educational." The base settled into its nocturnal rhythms around 2200 hours, most personnel either asleep or manning essential watch stations. I waited another hour before making my way to the armory, using my instructor's access to check out my personal favorite, a Barrett M82A1 50 caliber sniper rifle that I'd requisitioned for advanced training purposes. The desert night was crisp and clear, stars sharp as diamonds against the black sky. I made my way to Range 7, the longest shooting lane on the base, carrying the Barrett and a bag of match-grade ammunition. This range was officially closed after dark, but my instructor privileges still carried some weight. In the darkness, away from watching eyes and whispered judgments, I could finally let my hands remember what they knew. I set up 6 targets at various distances, the closest at 400 meters, the farthest at 1200 meters. Moving targets, stationary targets, some barely visible even with night vision. The kind of shots that separated weekend warriors from professionals. The kind of shots I used to make while people were shooting back. The Barrett settled into my shoulder like coming home. 50 pounds of precision engineering, capable of punching through engine blocks at a mile. In Afghanistan, this rifle and I had been legend. Insurgents had learned to fear the crack of its report, knowing that death followed within seconds. My breathing slowed. My heart rate dropped. The tremor in my left hand, the one that plagued me during daylight hours, simply disappeared. The first shot took the 400-meter target center mass. The second punched through a target at 600 meters that was swaying in the desert breeze. The third, fourth, and fifth shots each found their marks at increasing distances, the satisfying ring of steel on steel echoing across the empty range. For the final shot, I aimed at a target 1,200 meters out, barely visible even through the rifle's scope. I held my breath, felt the natural pause between heartbeats, and squeezed the trigger with the patience of a surgeon. The target disappeared in a shower of sparks. "Damn, Riley!" I spun around to find Morales standing 20 meters behind me, her face illuminated by the green glow of night vision goggles. "How long have you been watching?" "Long enough." She approached slowly, studying the Barrett with professional appreciation. "That's some serious shooting, competition level. Hell, that's Olympic level." I began breaking down the rifle, my movements automatic after years of practice. Just keeping skills sharp. Bullshit. Morales sat down on the concrete shooting bench, her voice gentle but firm. "You've been sandbagging during qualification, playing down your abilities. Why?" The question hung between us like an accusation. Why, indeed? Because admitting I could still shoot meant admitting that everything else, the trembling hands, the missed shots, the whispered doubts, was psychological. Because being a failure was somehow safer than being a target. "The hand," I began. "The hand is fine when nobody's watching," Morales interrupted. "I've been keeping an eye on you, Riley. You move like a shooter, you think like a shooter, but the second someone puts eyes on you, you fold like a rookie." She was right, and we both knew it. The injury had healed months ago, but the doubt had lingered. Easier to be underestimated than to risk failing when it mattered. Easier to be forgotten than to be found wanting. "Hale's planning something for Friday," Morales said quietly. "Word from the admin office is he wants to make an example during the demonstration, show the visiting brass how to separate wheat from chaff."
I finished packing the Barrett, my movement steady in the darkness. Then I guess he'll get his chance. But as we walked back toward the barracks, I found myself thinking about those 6 perfect shots, about the feeling of absolute control that came with the rifle in my hands and no one watching but the stars, about the woman I used to be and the woman I might still become. 3 days until the demonstration. 3 days to decide whether Lieutenant Commander Riley Grant was going to remain a cautionary tale or become something entirely different. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of heat that made mirages dance on the horizon by 900 hours. I stood with the other instructors, watching the recruits run through combat movement drills, their uniforms already dark with sweat despite the early hour. The base had that electric tension that comes before inspections, everyone trying too hard, everyone afraid of being singled out. Sergeant Kowalski had positioned himself near the center of the training yard, his voice carrying across the dusty ground as he offered helpful commentary to anyone within earshot. Marines had a gift for making their presence known, and Red Kowalski was no exception. Built like a fire hydrant with an attitude to match. He'd spent the last 3 days making sure everyone knew exactly what he thought about Navy standards. "Time!" I called out as the recruits finished their tactical reload exercise. Most had completed it within acceptable parameters, though Brooks had fumbled his magazine change and was looking frustrated with himself. "Not bad for squids," Kowalski said loud enough for everyone to hear. "Course, in the Corps, we expect a little more speed. Life-or-death situations don't wait for you to figure out which end of the rifle to hold." A few of the recruits glanced nervously between us. They could sense the undercurrent of tension, even if they didn't fully understand the politics at play. Brooks was staring at his weapon like it personally offended him. "Your turn, Commander," Kowalski continued, his tone carrying just enough respect to avoid insubordination while making his contempt clear. "Why don't you show these sailors how to do it, unless the hand's acting up again?"
Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a discharged round. Around us, conversation died as every recruit, every instructor, every passing technician turned to watch. This was the moment Kowalski had been building toward, a public test of the damaged goods, conducted in front of an audience that would spread the story across the entire base. I picked up the M16, checking the chamber and safety with movements that felt sluggish under the weight of watching eyes. My left hand was already beginning its familiar tremor, that involuntary shake that seemed to appear whenever people were paying attention. The rifle that had felt perfectly balanced in my hands 12 hours earlier now seemed awkward, foreign. "Standard tactical reload," I announced, my voice steady despite the chaos in my head. "Starting on my mark." The first magazine seated properly, but my grip shifted as I brought the weapon up to firing position. The second magazine, the one that should have been automatic, muscle memory from 10,000 repetitions, went in crooked. I had to adjust, reset, try again. Precious seconds bleeding away while Kowalski's smirk grew wider. When I finally completed the drill, my time was nearly double what it should have been. The kind of performance that got people killed in real combat situations. "Interesting technique," Kowalski said, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "Guess some skills don't transfer as well as others. Maybe the Navy should consider lighter weapons, something more manageable for personnel with limitations." A few of the younger recruits actually laughed, not maliciously. They were too green to understand what they were witnessing, but the sound cut deeper than any insult. These were supposed to be my students, the next generation of sailors I was supposed to prepare for combat. Instead, they were watching their instructor become a punchline. Brooks wasn't laughing. The young ensign was studying me with the kind of intensity that suggested he was trying to reconcile what he was seeing with something else he'd heard or read. But even his support felt like pity. "Dead weight," Kowalski said quietly, but not quietly enough. "Some people know when it's time to step aside. Others have to be shown." Admiral Hale chose that moment to appear, emerging from the administration building with his usual entourage. He took in the scene with calculating eyes, the scattered recruits, the awkward silence, me standing with a rifle that might as well have been a foreign object. "Problem here, Sergeant?" Hale asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. "No, sir," Kowalski replied, snapping to attention. "Just demonstrating proper weapons handling for the recruits. The commander was showing us some, alternative techniques." Hale's smile was razor-thin. "I see. Carry on, then. I'm sure the recruits are learning a great deal." As he walked away, I caught sight of his reflection in the administration building's windows, a man who had just seen his suspicions confirmed. Tomorrow's demonstration was going to be a massacre, and I was going to be the sacrificial lamb. Dr. Janelle Carter's office smelled like disinfectant and strong coffee, a combination that somehow managed to be both sterile and comforting. I sat on the examination table, rolling up my sleeve while she reviewed my medical file on her computer screen. The base doctor was a no-nonsense woman in her 40s, with graying hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd seen enough military bullshit to last several lifetimes. "How's the hand feeling today, Commander?" she asked, pulling on latex gloves with practiced efficiency. "Fine," I said automatically. "No pain, full range of motion." She took my left hand in hers, manipulating the fingers and wrist with gentle pressure. The injury site, where shrapnel from an IED had torn through muscle and fractured bone, was now just a thin scar across my palm. The hand moved normally, responded normally, functioned normally. "Grip strength is excellent," Carter said, making notes on her tablet. "Flexibility is within normal parameters. Nerve response is good." She looked up at me with those sharp brown eyes. "So, why are you shooting like a rookie?" The question caught me off guard. "Excuse me?" "I've seen your qualification scores, Riley, present and past. There's a significant discrepancy between what your hand can physically do and what you're actually doing with it." She sat down on her rolling stool, studying me like a puzzle she was trying to solve. "Want to tell me what's really going on?" I flexed my fingers, watching the tendons move under scarred skin. "Maybe I'm not as good as I used to be. Maybe the injury did more damage than we thought." "Bullshit." Carter's voice was matter-of-fact, without heat. "I've been treating combat injuries for 15 years. I know the difference between physical limitation and psychological hesitation. Your hand is healed, Commander. The question is whether you are." The silence stretched between us while I tried to find an answer that made sense. How do you explain that competence feels more dangerous than failure? That being good at something means people expect you to be good at everything? That it's easier to be dismissed than to be found wanting when it really matters? "I hear Admiral Hale has some special plans for tomorrow's demonstration," Carter said quietly. "Plans that involve making examples of certain personnel?" Word traveled fast on a base this size. "I'm sure the Admiral knows what he's doing." "I'm sure he thinks he does." She signed something on her tablet with swift strokes. "I'm clearing you for full duty, including weapons training and qualification. No restrictions, no limitations. Medically speaking, you're as capable as you ever were." She handed me the clearance form, her expression serious. "But Riley, that young ensign, Brooks, he's been asking questions about you, about your service record, your deployments. Kid's smart enough to know there's more to the story than what people are whispering about."
Brooks, the earnest young officer who still believed that merit mattered more than politics, who looked at Admiral Hale with the kind of hero worship that reminded me of my own youth, back when I thought the world was simple and good people always won. "He's going to be watching tomorrow," Carter continued. "All of them are. They're going to see what kind of leader you really are, underneath all the doubt and self-protection. Make sure they see the right thing." That evening, I sat in my quarters staring at the medical clearance form. On paper, I was fully qualified for any duty the Navy could assign. No restrictions, no limitations, no excuses. The injury that had become my shield was officially no longer an issue. But shields worked both ways. They protected you from incoming fire, but they also kept you from firing back. My reflection in the window showed a woman who looked older than her 38 years, marked by desert sun and combat stress and months of careful mediocrity. The woman in Afghanistan would have laughed at what I'd become, a competent officer hiding behind a healed injury because it was safer than risking real failure. Tomorrow, Admiral Hale was going to try to end my career in front of half the base. The smart play was to let him. Take the transfer, accept the desk job, and fade quietly into military obscurity. Safe, secure, and completely meaningless. The alternative was to remember who I used to be, and that was the most terrifying option of all. Friday morning dawned clear and merciless, the Nevada sun already promising another day of punishing heat. By 800, the main firing range looked like a small military convention. Visiting officers from 3 different commands, a delegation from Pentagon procurement, and enough brass to outfit a parade band. Admiral Hale had positioned himself at the center of it all, holding court like a general planning a battle. I stood with the other instructors near the armory, watching the preparations with growing unease. 6 different weapon stations had been set up along the firing line, each one designed to showcase a specific aspect of Navy marksmanship training. The final station, my station, featured long-range precision shooting with the Barrett M82A1. "Quite a crowd," Morales said quietly, appearing at my elbow with 2 cups of coffee. "Word is, some Pentagon officials are here to evaluate training effectiveness. Budget implications." Translation: careers were going to be made or destroyed based on today's performance. The kind of high-stakes environment where competence mattered less than politics, and perception became reality. Ensign Brooks approached from the direction of the recruit barracks, his young face tight with concentration. He had spent the last 2 days asking careful questions about my service record, and I could see the confusion in his eyes as he tried to reconcile the whispered stories with whatever he'd discovered in official channels. "Commander Grant," he said, his voice carrying the formal courtesy that junior officers used when they weren't sure how to navigate complex situations. "I wanted to thank you for the training. It's been educational." There was something in his tone that suggested he meant more than the standard weapons instruction. The kid was trying to tell me something, but protocol and rank prevented him from being direct about it. Admiral Hale's voice cut across the range like a whip crack. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're ready to begin. Today's demonstration will showcase the advanced marksmanship capabilities we're developing here at Fallon. Each station represents a different aspect of combat shooting, designed to prepare our sailors for the realities of modern warfare." He gestured toward the first station, where a junior instructor was setting up for close-quarters combat drills. "We'll begin with basic weapon handling and progress through increasingly challenging scenarios. Our final demonstration will feature long-range precision shooting, a critical skill for special operations personnel." His eyes found mine across the crowd, and I could see the anticipation in his expression. This was what he'd been building toward, a public execution disguised as training evaluation. "Commander Grant," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the range. "Would you join us at the precision station? I believe our guests would be interested in seeing how we train our advanced marksmanship instructors." The crowd shifted, following his gesture toward the Barrett station where my rifle waited on its bipod. 200 meters of open ground suddenly felt like walking to a gallows. Every eye on the range followed my movement as I made my way to the firing line. "The Barrett M82A1, Hannes announced, for the benefit of the visiting officers. 50 caliber, semi-automatic, effective range beyond 1,500 meters. A formidable weapon that requires exceptional skill to employ effectively."
He paused, letting the implication sink in. Everyone present knew about my injury, my recent performance issues, my reputation as damaged goods. This was theater, and I was the tragic protagonist. Perhaps you could demonstrate proper shooting position for our guests, Commander. Show them what Navy precision looks like. The rifle felt impossibly heavy as I settled behind it, adjusting the bipod and checking the scope. 6 targets had been positioned at ranges from 400 to 1,200 meters, challenging shots even under ideal conditions. With half the Navy's senior leadership watching, they might as well have been on the moon. My hands were already shaking before I touched the trigger. The first shot went wide, kicking up dust 10 inches to the right of the 400-meter target. A murmur ran through the crowd, not surprise, but confirmation of expectations. I adjusted, compensated, fired again. Closer, but still a miss. By the 4th shot, I could hear whispered conversations behind me. By the 6th, someone was openly discussing whether I should be relieved of instructor duties. "Equipment malfunction," Hale suggested, his voice carrying false concern. "Perhaps the rifle needs adjustment?" Admiral Hale stepped forward with the confident stride of a man who had never doubted his own capabilities. The crowd parted before him like water, senior officers nodding deferentially as he approached the Barrett station. His uniform was immaculate despite the desert heat, his bearing perfect, his expression that of a teacher about to provide a valuable lesson. "Sometimes," he said loudly enough for the entire range to hear, "it helps to have fresh perspective on a problem. May I, Commander?" It wasn't really a question. Before I could respond, he was lifting the Barrett from its position, his hands moving over the weapon with theatrical precision. The crowd pressed closer, sensing that something significant was about to happen. "The key to precision shooting," Hale announced, settling behind the rifle with obvious confidence, "is proper fundamentals. Breathing, sight picture, trigger control. Basic skills that separate professionals from amateurs." He shouldered the weapon with a flourish, making sure everyone could see his textbook form. The Barrett looked impressive in his hands, 50 pounds of military engineering operated by a decorated combat veteran. The image was perfect, commanding, exactly what the visiting brass expected to see from Navy leadership. Then he fired. The shot went so wide that it didn't even hit the target frame. Dirt erupted from the berm 30 meters to the left of the 400-meter target, as if he'd been aiming at empty desert. A confused silence fell over the crowd. "Wind compensation," Hale said quickly, adjusting his position. "Desert conditions require constant recalibration." His second shot was no better, high and right, missing everything but sky. His third actually hit the target frame, but 6 feet below the bullseye. With each successive miss, his confident facade began to crack. The easy smile became forced. The theatrical gestures turned hurried, desperate. "This rifle," he said, finally, his voice tight with frustration, "appears to have serious calibration issues. The scope is clearly misaligned, the barrel potentially warped. Commander Grant, this weapon is not serviceable for precision shooting." He stood up from the firing position, his face flushed with embarrassment and growing anger. The Barrett had made him look like a fool in front of half the Navy's senior leadership, and he was casting around for someone to blame. "In fact," he continued, his voice rising, "I question whether any of the equipment at this facility meets acceptable standards. Perhaps it's time for a complete overhaul of the training program." That was the moment everything changed. Standing there, watching him blame the rifle for his own incompetence, something inside me finally snapped. Not with anger. Anger was uncontrolled, unprofessional, dangerous. This was something colder, more focused. The same feeling I'd had in Afghanistan when enemy snipers made the mistake of revealing their positions. "Sir," I said quietly, stepping forward, "I'd like my rifle back." The simple request hung in the desert air like a challenge. Hale turned toward me, his eyes narrowing as he processed what I'd just said. Around us, the crowd had gone completely silent, sensing that they were witnessing something significant. "Excuse me?" "My rifle, sir. I'd like it back." For a moment, I thought he might refuse. His hands tightened on the stock of the Barrett, and I could see him calculating the political implications of the situation. But with 200 people watching, including Pentagon officials and senior commanders from other bases, he had no choice. "Sir," he said, his voice carrying a warning, "I don't think additional attempts with this equipment will—" "My rifle, sir," I repeated, my voice calm but carrying the kind of authority that came from 18 years of military service. "Please." He handed it over with obvious reluctance, his movements sharp with suppressed anger. As my hands closed around the familiar weight of the Barrett, I felt something settle into place. Not just muscle memory, but identity, purpose, the clarity that came from finally remembering who I was supposed to be. The rifle felt perfect in my hands, balanced, ready, like coming home after a long deployment. I settled behind it with movements that were pure instinct, adjusting position and sight picture without conscious thought. Around me, the desert fell silent except for the distant whisper of wind across sand. 200 people watched and waited, but for the first time in months, I didn't care about their expectations or their doubts. I cared about the targets, and the rifle, and the simple mathematics of making impossible shots look easy.
The first target was 400 meters out, a standard silhouette that wavered slightly in the heat haze. I found it in my scope, controlled my breathing, felt the natural pause between heartbeats. The Barrett roared, and the target disappeared in a shower of torn steel. I didn't pause, didn't celebrate, didn't look up to gauge the crowd's reaction. The second target was 600 meters out and moving slightly in the desert breeze. I tracked it, led it, squeezed the trigger with the patience of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Another hit, clean, center mass. The third target, the fourth, the fifth, each one fell with mechanical precision, the Barrett cycling smoothly as I worked through the sequence. The sixth and final target was positioned at 1,200 meters, barely visible even through the scope's magnification. I took my time with that one, felt the wind, calculated the ballistics, remembered the woman who had once been legend in the mountains of Afghanistan. Then I squeezed the trigger one last time. The distant target rang like a bell as the .50 caliber round punched through dead center. 6 shots, 6 hits, 6 impossible targets destroyed in under 90 seconds. I stood up from behind the rifle and finally looked at the crowd. Admiral Hale's face had gone pale, his eyes wide with something that might have been shock or fear. The visiting officials were leaning forward, suddenly very interested in what they were seeing. Brooks was staring at me like he just witnessed a miracle. And for the first time in months, I felt like Lieutenant Commander Riley Grant again. The silence that followed my 6th shot was absolute, the kind of quiet that comes after thunder when the world holds its breath waiting for the next strike. 200 people stood frozen on the Nevada range, their eyes moving between the destroyed targets and the woman who had just made the impossible look routine. Admiral Hale was the first to break the spell, his voice cutting across the desert air with the sharp edge of wounded authority. "Impressive shooting, Commander, though I suspect the rifle's calibration issues may have been temporarily resolved." He stepped toward me, reaching for the Barrett with the presumption of someone accustomed to taking what he wanted. "Perhaps we should have the armory check this weapon thoroughly, ensure it's properly maintained for future use." His fingers closed around the rifle's stock, and that's when something inside me finally completely snapped. I didn't think about rank or protocol or the political consequences of what I was about to do. 18 years of military discipline couldn't override the primal response of a warrior who had just reclaimed her identity. When Hale tried to lift the Barrett from my hands, I moved with the fluid precision that had once made me legend. The joint lock was textbook perfect, a simple twist of his wrist combined with leverage that sent him to his knees before he fully understood what was happening. The crack of small bones breaking was audible even over the desert wind, followed immediately by his sharp intake of breath. "My rifle," I said, calmly, my voice carrying the kind of calm that preceded violence.
My demonstration, my range. Hale's face had gone white with pain and shock, his right hand cradled against his chest at an angle that suggested serious injury. Around us, the crowd stirred uneasily, senior officers reaching for radios, security personnel moving closer, the careful choreography of a situation spiraling rapidly out of control. But I wasn't done. Still holding the Barrett, I turned back toward the range where additional targets had been positioned for the advanced demonstration. These weren't static silhouettes I'd just destroyed. These were moving targets, mechanized systems that simulated combat conditions. 6 targets, traveling at different speeds, different ranges, designed to challenge even the most skilled marksman. "Computer," I called out to the range control booth, my voice carrying clearly across the suddenly electric air. "Activate Sequence 7, maximum difficulty." The targets began moving immediately, steel silhouettes mounted on tracks that carried them across the desert landscape at varying speeds. The closest was 500 meters out and moving left to right. The farthest was nearly 1,500 meters away, appearing and disappearing behind berms like an enemy sniper changing positions. I settled behind the Barrett again, feeling the familiar kiss of the stock against my shoulder. My breathing slowed automatically, heart rate dropping into the zone where time stretches and impossible shots become mathematical certainties. This was who I was. This was who I had always been, underneath the doubt and self-protection and careful mediocrity. The first target was moving at a steady pace, its trajectory predictable. I led it slightly, compensated for wind and distance, squeezed the trigger with the patience of someone who had done this in places where missing meant death. The .50 caliber round took the target's center mass, the impact spinning it completely around before it crashed to the desert floor. Target 2 was faster, weaving between obstacles in an evasive pattern. I tracked it through the scope, waited for the moment when its movement became momentarily predictable, fired. Another hit.
Target 3. Target 4. Each shot placed with surgical precision, each impact destroying not just steel and machinery, but months of whispered doubts and careful assumptions about what Lieutenant Commander Riley Grant could accomplish. The 5th target was the most challenging, a small silhouette at extreme range, moving erratically behind cover. I took my time with that one, feeling the wind shift across my cheek, calculating ballistics that most people couldn't visualize. The shot required leading the target by nearly 6 feet, accounting for bullet drop and drift that turned marksmanship into higher mathematics. I squeezed the trigger and watched through the scope as the round found its mark with devastating precision. The 6th and final target had stopped moving, as if the operator in the control booth was giving me an easier shot. But easy wasn't the point anymore. The point was proving that some things don't break, no matter how much pressure you apply. I put the final round through the center of the target at 1,400 meters, the impact so clean it looked like the steel had simply decided to disintegrate. 6 moving targets, 6 impossible shots, 6 pieces of evidence that the woman everyone thought was finished had just been getting started. When I stood up from behind the Barrett, the silence was different, not shocked anymore, but awed. 200 military professionals had just witnessed something that redefined their understanding of what was possible. Admiral Hale was still on his knees, cradling his broken hand and staring at me with something that might have been fear. "Equipment functioning normally, sir," I said, my voice carrying across the range with absolute calm. "No calibration issues detected." The aftermath of perfect shooting echoed across the range like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. For nearly 30 seconds, nobody moved, nobody spoke, nobody seemed to breathe. Then Ensign Brooks began to clap, slowly at first, then with growing enthusiasm as the magnitude of what he'd witnessed sank in. The applause spread through the crowd like wildfire. Junior officers who had been whispering about my limitations were now staring with unconcealed admiration. Senior commanders who had written me off as damaged goods were suddenly recalculating their assessments. Even the visiting Pentagon officials were leaning forward, clearly recognizing that they had just seen something extraordinary. Admiral Hale struggled to his feet, his injured hand pressed against his chest and his face flushed with pain and humiliation. The man who had arrived that morning as the undisputed authority on the range now looked diminished, ordinary, exposed as someone whose reputation exceeded his actual capabilities. "Medical assistance to the firing line," someone called out, and within moments, Dr. Carter was kneeling beside Hale, examining his injured wrist with professional efficiency. "Fractured radius," she announced matter-of-factly, not bothering to lower her voice. "Clean break. Should heal fine with proper treatment. I'll need to get you to the medical facility immediately." As Hale was led away by medics, his entourage following like confused sheep, the crowd began to reorganize itself around a new reality. The demonstration that was supposed to end my career had instead elevated me to something approaching mythical status. Sergeant Kowalski approached slowly, his earlier swagger completely absent. The Marine who had spent 3 days making jokes about Navy standards and broken down instructors now looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. "Commander," he said, his voice carrying the kind of respect that couldn't be faked. That was professional-level shooting. Competition level. Hell, that was something I'd never seen before. I nodded acknowledgement, but didn't respond. There was nothing to say. The shooting spoke for itself, and words would only diminish what had just happened. Brooks appeared at my other side, his young face bright with excitement and something that looked like vindication. "I knew it," he said quietly, just loud enough for me to hear. "I spent 2 days going through service records, deployment files, classified citations. Most of it was redacted, but what I could piece together, Commander, you were a legend over there. The insurgents had a name for you. Ghost Shot. They thought you were a myth." Ghost Shot. I hadn't heard that name in over a year, but it brought back memories of mountain peaks and impossible distances, of targets that disappeared before they ever heard the sound of the rifle that killed them. A different war, a different world, a different version of myself that I thought was gone forever. "Why did you hide it?" Brooks asked, his voice carrying genuine confusion. "Why let people think you were washed up when you could do that?" It was a fair question, and one I wasn't sure I could answer honestly. How do you explain that competence creates expectations? That being good at something means people assume you're good at everything? That sometimes it's easier to be underestimated than to risk failing when it truly matters? "Because," I said finally, "reputation is a burden. Legends are expected to be legendary every single time they step up to the line. Sometimes it's easier to be human." Chief Morales appeared through the crowd, her dark eyes bright with satisfaction and something that might have been pride. She'd known all along what I was capable of, had been waiting months for me to remember it myself.
"Hell of a demonstration, Commander," she said with a grin that could have powered the base generator. "Think that might have made an impression on our visitors?" Around us, the crowd was slowly dispersing, but the conversations were animated, excited. The story of what had just happened would spread through the Navy's informal networks within hours, growing in the telling until it became the kind of legend that junior officers would discuss in hushed tones for years to come. One of the Pentagon officials, a stern-faced woman with captain's bars and the bearing of someone who made important decisions, approached our small group with purposeful strides. "Commander Grant," she said, extending her hand. "Captain Sarah Mitchell, Navy Personnel Command. I think we need to talk." 3 hours later, I sat in the base commander's office reviewing a set of orders that would have seemed impossible that morning. Captain Mitchell had made her offer with the kind of directness that military professionals appreciated. Advanced precision shooting, combat experience, proven ability to train special operations personnel. What happened today suggests we may have overlooked an obvious candidate. Overlooked. The word carried layers of meaning. Acknowledgement that politics and perception had nearly cost the Navy a valuable asset. But military organizations were pragmatic above all else. When they found something that worked, they used it. The base was settling into its evening rhythms as I walked back to my quarters, passing groups of recruits who now looked at me with something approaching awe. Word had spread quickly through the informal networks that connected every military installation, and by dinner time, half the base knew some version of what had happened on the range. Brooks intercepted me near the barracks, his expression serious despite the excitement that still lingered in his eyes. "Commander, I wanted to thank you. For today, for showing me what real leadership looks like." "And what does it look like, Ensign?" He considered the question carefully, the way young officers do when they're trying to articulate something important. "It looks like being willing to be underestimated, letting people think they know your limitations until the moment you prove them wrong. It looks like caring more about getting the job done than about what people think of you while you're doing it." Smart kid. He was going to make a good officer if he could hold on to that insight through the political challenges that lay ahead. Admiral Hale taught me something too. He showed me what happens when you believe your own press releases, when you think authority comes from rank instead of competence. I nodded toward the medical facility where Hale was probably receiving treatment for his broken wrist and wounded pride. The Admiral is a good officer who made a mistake. Don't judge him too harshly for one bad day. But Brooks shook his head. "With respect, Commander, it wasn't one bad day. It was the culmination of a career built on appearances instead of substance. Today just made that visible to everyone else." That evening, alone in my quarters, I finally allowed myself to process what had happened. The woman who had woken up that morning as a broken-down instructor clinging to relevance was now facing a future that seemed almost too good to believe. But more importantly, I had remembered who I was underneath all the doubt and self-protection. The photograph from Afghanistan still sat on my desk. That young sniper team celebrating a successful mission, faces painted with camouflage and eyes bright with the satisfaction of work well done. But for the first time in months, I could look at that picture without feeling like it showed a stranger. The injury was real, the doubt was real, the months of careful mediocrity and whispered failures had been real too. But resilience wasn't about pretending none of that had happened. It was about discovering that you could survive it, adapt to it, and ultimately transcend it. My reflection in the window showed a woman who looked different than she had that morning. Not younger, but more focused, more certain. The kind of person who could make impossible shots look routine and turn humiliation into triumph through simple persistence.
Tomorrow, I would begin packing for the transfer to Special Warfare Command. In 6 months, I would be training the Navy's most elite operators, sharing the hard-won knowledge that came from years of combat and the bitter education of temporary failure. The woman everyone thought was finished would help create the next generation of warriors. But tonight, I sat in my quarters on a remote desert base, finally understanding that some things don't break, they just discover new ways to be strong. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly beyond my window, broken only by distant mountains and the harsh beauty of survival in an unforgiving landscape. It was fitting, somehow. This place had taught me that legends weren't born from perfection, but from the willingness to keep trying when everything seemed impossible. 6 shots, 6 hits, 6 pieces of proof that Lieutenant Commander Riley Grant wasn't a cautionary tale after all. She was just getting started. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.